Gerald, where is my locket? My voice trembled slightly as I held up the empty jewelry box. He glanced up from his newspaper, barely registering my distress. I don't know, Annie. You probably misplaced it. Misplaced it. That locket was the last gift from my mother before she passed. I didn't misplace it. I kept it in the same spot every day for the past 12 years. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Gerald, this is important. Please help me look for it. He sighed, folding the newspaper with deliberate slowness. Fine, but I'm sure it'll turn up. We searched the bedroom, then the living room. I even checked the kitchen, though I knew it wouldn't be there. After an hour, Gerald shrugged. Maybe Patricia saw it. She was here last week, right? The mention of his mother sent a chill down my spine. Patricia had a way of making herself at home in our house, rearranging things to her liking. I hadn't noticed the locket missing until now, but the thought of her having it made my stomach churn. Annie, why don't you call her? Gerald suggested, already heading back to his newspaper. I hesitated, but there was no other option. I dialed Patricia's number, my fingers shaking. She answered on the second ring. Hello, Patricia. It's Annie. I was wondering if you happened to see my locket when you were here last week. There was a pause, then a chuckle. Oh, that old thing. I thought it was just lying around. I have it right here. My heart skipped a beat. Could you please return it? It means a lot to me. Well, I'm quite fond of it myself now. It suits me, don't you think? Her tone was dripping with condescension. I clenched my fist, trying to keep my voice calm. It's a family heirloom, Patricia. It belonged to my mother. There was another pause, then a dismissive laugh. You always were sentimental, Annie. I'll think about it. The line went dead, and I stood there, phone in hand, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. Gerald looked up from his paper, noticing my expression. What did she say? She has it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And she won't give it back. Gerald shook his head. Just let it go, Annie. It's not worth the trouble. Not worth the trouble. How could he say that? I felt a surge of determination. No, Gerald. This is important to me. You need to talk to her. He sighed again, a sound that grated on my nerves. I'll see what I can do. Days passed and Gerald did nothing. Patricia continued to flaunt the locket every time she visited, a smug smile on her face. It was clear she had no intention of returning it. One evening, after another frustrating visit from Patricia, I found myself in the kitchen with Charles, Gerald's father. He had always been kind and understanding, a stark contrast to his wife. Is everything all right, Annie? He asked, noticing my distress. I hesitated, then decided to confide in him. Charles, Patricia took my locket. It was my mother's, and she refuses to give it back. Gerald won't do anything about it. Charles frowned, his eyes softening with sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that, Annie. Patricia can be difficult. I should have stood up to her more over the years. His words gave me a glimmer of hope. Charles, I need your help. I can't let her get away with this. He nodded, a determined look in his eyes. We'll figure something out, Annie. You have my support. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of resolve. With Charles on my side, I knew we could come up with a plan to teach Patricia a lesson. It was time to stand up for myself and reclaim what was rightfully mine. Charles sat across from me at the kitchen table, his expression serious. Annie, we need to do something about Patricia. She's gone too far this time. I nodded, feeling a sense of solidarity with him. I agree. But what can we do? She's so manipulative and Gerald, well, he's no help. Charles leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Patricia has always been headstrong, but she's never faced real consequences for her actions. Maybe it's time she did. I felt a spark of hope. What do you have in mind? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. I have a savings account that Patricia doesn't know about. We could use the passbook as bait. If she thinks it's your savings, it might draw her out. My eyes widened. You'd do that for me? Charles smiled warmly. Annie, you've been more of a daughter to me than Patricia has been a wife. I want to help you. We spent the next hour planning. Charles would place the passbook in my drawer, and I would subtly hint about my savings in conversations with Patricia. It was a risky plan, but it felt empowering to finally take action. The next day, I found an opportunity to set the plan in motion. Patricia had stopped by unannounced, as usual, and was sipping tea in the living room. I joined her, forcing a smile. "Patricia, I've been thinking about the future," I said casually. "I've managed to save up a decent amount over the years." Her eyes flickered with interest. "Oh, how much have you saved?" I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Enough to be comfortable. I've been very careful with my money." Patricia's lips curled into a sly smile. "That's wise of you, Annie. It's always good to have a little nest egg." I nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction as I saw the gears turning in her mind. The seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Patricia's visits became more frequent. She made snide comments about my housekeeping, criticized my cooking, and generally made herself a nuisance. But I knew what she was really after. One afternoon, I caught her in my bedroom, rummaging through my dresser. She looked up, feigning innocence. "Oh, Annie, I was just looking for a tissue. My allergies are acting up." I forced a smile. "Of course, Patricia. Help yourself." She left the room, and I checked the drawer. The passbook was still there, but I knew it was only a matter of time before she found it. The tension was building, and I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. A few days later, Gerald came home with surprising news. "Annie, Mom and I have been talking. We think it would be a good idea to buy a two-family house. That way, we can all live together and help each other out." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "And how do you plan to pay for it?" He hesitated, then said, "Well, we could use your savings as a down payment. It makes sense, doesn't it?" I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. "So, you and your mother have been planning this behind my back?" Gerald looked uncomfortable. "It's for the best, Annie. We're family." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Gerald, those are my savings. You had no right to make decisions about them without me." He looked taken aback. "I thought you'd be happy to help." I shook my head, feeling a sense of resolve. "No, Gerald. This isn't right. I won't let you and Patricia take advantage of me." That evening, I called Charles and told him everything. He listened quietly, then said, "It's time to confront them, Annie. We'll do it together." The next day, Charles came over, and we waited for Patricia and Gerald to arrive. When they did, Charles didn't waste any time. "Patricia, Gerald, we need to talk." They looked at him, surprised. "What's this about, Dad?" Gerald asked. Charles held up the passbook. "This is my savings account, not Annie's. You had no right to plan anything without her consent." Patricia's face turned red, and Gerald looked stunned. "But we thought." Charles cut him off. "You thought wrong, and now there will be consequences." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. I felt a sense of vindication, but I knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The room was thick with tension as Charles's words hung in the air. Patricia's face was a mask of indignation, while Gerald looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Charles, how dare you?" Patricia spat, her voice trembling with rage. "This is none of your business." Charles stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "It became my business when you decided to use my savings without permission. And it became my business when you disrespected Annie." Gerald stepped forward, trying to mediate. "Dad, let's not blow this out of proportion. We just thought." "No, Gerald," I interrupted, my voice steady. "You didn't think. You and Patricia assumed you could manipulate me, but that's not going to happen." Patricia's eyes narrowed, and she turned to Gerald. "Are you just going to stand there and let them talk to us like this?" Gerald looked torn, glancing between his mother and father. "Mom, Dad's right. We should have talked to Annie first." Patricia's face turned a deeper shade of red. "I can't believe this. After everything I've done for this family." Charles shook his head. "Patricia, this isn't about you. This is about respect and trust, both of which you've violated." Patricia stormed out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Gerald looked helpless, caught between his parents and me. Later that evening, Charles and I sat in the kitchen, discussing our next move. "We need to escalate this," Charles said, his voice calm but determined. "Patricia won't back down easily, and Gerald needs to see the consequences of his actions." I nodded, feeling a mix of resolve and apprehension. "What do you suggest?" Charles leaned in, his eyes serious. "We need to make it clear that this behavior won't be tolerated. Gerald has to understand that siding with Patricia has real consequences." The next morning, I woke up to find Gerald sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. "Annie, we need to talk." I sat down across from him, bracing myself. "What is it, Gerald?" He looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I know I've been a terrible husband. I've let Mom control too much of our lives. But I want to make things right." I felt a flicker of hope but kept my guard up. "How do you plan to do that?" He took a deep breath. "I'll talk to Mom. I'll make her understand that she can't treat you this way. And I'll support whatever decision you make about the savings." I studied his face, searching for sincerity. "Are you really willing to stand up to her?" He nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, I am." That evening, Gerald and I went to Patricia's house. Charles had insisted on coming along for support. As we walked in, Patricia was waiting in the living room, her arms crossed and her expression defiant. "What's this about?" she demanded. Gerald stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mom, we need to talk. You can't keep treating Annie this way. And you can't use Dad's savings without permission." Patricia's eyes blazed with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that? After everything I've done for you." Gerald stood his ground. "Mom, this isn't about you. It's about respect. And if you can't respect Annie, then we need to reconsider our relationship." Patricia's face contorted with anger, and she turned to Charles. "Are you behind this? Turning my own son against me?" Charles shook his head. "No, Patricia. Gerald is making his own decisions. It's time you faced the consequences of your actions." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but there was no remorse in her expression. "Fine. If that's how you all feel, then maybe it's time I left." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Gerald looked torn, but he remained firm. "Mom, we love you, but we can't continue like this." Patricia stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Charles put a hand on Gerald's shoulder. "You did the right thing, son." Gerald nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "I hope so, Dad. I really hope so." As we drove home, I felt a sense of accomplishment but knew the battle was far from over. Patricia's departure was just the beginning. The real challenge would be rebuilding the trust and respect that had been shattered. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. We were finally moving in the right direction. The days following Patricia's departure were a whirlwind of emotions. Gerald seemed genuinely committed to mending our relationship, but the strain was evident. We were navigating uncharted waters, and the uncertainty weighed on both of us. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Gerald walked into the kitchen, his face pale. "Annie, we need to talk." I turned off the stove and faced him, my heart pounding. "What is it?" He hesitated, then handed me a letter. "It's from Patricia." I took the envelope, my hands trembling. Opening it, I read the contents aloud. "Dear Gerald and Annie, I've decided to stay with my sister for a while. I need time to think about everything that's happened. Gerald, I know you're angry with me, but I've always acted in what I believed were your best interests. I hope you understand that one day. Patricia." I looked up at Gerald, my emotions a mix of relief and apprehension. "What do you think this means?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I think it's best if we focus on us for now." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "Agreed. We need to rebuild trust and respect." The next few weeks were a blend of cautious optimism and underlying tension. Gerald made an effort to be more present, and I tried to let go of some of the resentment. But the shadow of Patricia's influence still loomed over us. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I stumbled upon an old box of letters. Curiosity piqued. I sat down and began to read through them. They were love letters between Charles and Patricia, written in the early years of their marriage. The warmth and affection in those letters were a stark contrast to the woman I knew. As I continued reading, one letter caught my attention. It was dated shortly after Gerald's birth and mentioned a significant family secret. My heart raced as I read the words. Charles, I've been hiding something from you for a long time. Gerald is not your biological son. I had an affair before we got married, and I never had the courage to tell you. I hope you can forgive me. Patricia. I sat there, stunned. This revelation changed everything. How could I tell Gerald? How would Charles react? The weight of the secret pressed down on me, and I knew I had to make a decision. That evening, I called Charles and asked him to come over. When he arrived, I handed him the letter, my hands shaking. Charles, I found this in the attic. You need to read it. He took the letter, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his face turned ashen and he sank into a chair. I can't believe this, he whispered. All these years. I placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Charles. I didn't know. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with pain. Annie, we need to tell Gerald. He deserves to know the truth. I nodded, dreading the conversation ahead. Yes, he does. We waited for Gerald to come home, the tension in the room palpable. When he walked in, he immediately sensed something was wrong. What's going on? Charles stood up, his expression solemn. Gerald, there's something you need to know. It's about your mother. Gerald's face hardened. What now? Charles handed him the letter. Read this. Gerald took the letter, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his face turned pale, and he looked up at us, his voice shaking. Is this true? Charles nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. I'm afraid so. Gerald sank into a chair, his hands trembling. I don't know what to say. This changes everything. I knelt beside him, my heart breaking for him. Gerald, we'll get through this together. But we need to decide how to move forward. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. I need some time to process this. I don't know what to do. Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. Take all the time you need, son. We're here for you. As Gerald retreated to our bedroom, I felt a sense of dread. This revelation had the potential to tear our family apart, but it also offered a chance for a new beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. We couldn't go back to the way things were. It was time to face the truth and make some difficult decisions. The days following the revelation about Gerald's parentage were a blur. Gerald withdrew into himself, barely speaking to anyone. Charles tried to be supportive, but the tension between them was palpable. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do anything that might make the situation worse. One evening, I found Gerald sitting alone in the living room, staring at an old family photo. I took a deep breath and sat down beside him. Gerald, we need to talk. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the photo. What's there to talk about, Annie? My whole life has been a lie. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. I know this is hard, but we can't ignore it. We need to figure out what to do next. He finally turned to me, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. What do you suggest? Confronting Mom? She's already gone. I hesitated, then said, we need to focus on us, on rebuilding our relationship. But we also need to address the financial situation. Your mother's actions have put us in a difficult position. Gerald sighed, rubbing his temples. I know. I've been thinking about that. We need to figure out a way to repay Dad. The next morning, I called Charles and asked him to come over. When he arrived, we sat down in the kitchen, discussing our options. Charles, we need to come up with a plan to repay you, I said. Charles shook his head. Annie, I appreciate the sentiment, but this isn't about the money. It's about trust and respect. Gerald, you need to take responsibility for your actions. Gerald nodded, looking determined. I understand, Dad. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. There is one way you can start. I have a business associate who's looking for someone to manage a new project. It's a demanding job, but it pays well. It could help you get back on your feet. Gerald looked surprised. You'd do that for me? Charles smiled. I believe in second chances, son. But you need to prove that you're serious about changing. Gerald agreed, and the next day he started his new job. The hours were long, and the work was challenging, but he seemed committed to making it work. I felt a glimmer of hope, but I knew we still had a long way to go. A few weeks later, I received a call from Patricia. Her voice was strained, and I could hear the tension in her words. Annie, I need to talk to you. Can we meet? I hesitated, then agreed. We met at a small cafe and she looked different, tired, defeated. What do you want, Patricia? She sighed, looking down at her hands. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. I realize I've made mistakes, and I want to make things right. I felt a surge of anger. You've caused so much pain, Patricia. How do you expect to make things right? She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try. I've decided to sell some of my assets to repay Charles. It's the least I can do. I was taken aback. This was the last thing I expected. Why the change of heart? She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I've lost everything, Annie. My family, my dignity. I need to make amends. I took a deep breath, trying to process her words. This is a start, Patricia. But it's going to take more than money to fix what's broken. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, but I'm willing to try. As I left the cafe, I felt a mix of emotions. Patricia's gesture was unexpected, but it didn't erase the pain she'd caused. The path to healing was long and uncertain, but at least it was a step in the right direction. That evening, I told Gerald about my meeting with Patricia. He looked surprised, then thoughtful. Maybe she's finally realized the damage she's done. I nodded. Maybe. But we need to focus on us. On rebuilding our life together. He reached out, taking my hand. We will, Annie. One step at a time. As we sat there, holding hands, I felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but we were moving forward together. And for the first time in a long while, I believed we could make it through. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Gerald threw himself into his new job, working long hours and coming home exhausted but determined. Patricia's gesture of selling her assets to repay Charles was a step in the right direction, but it was clear that the wounds she had inflicted would take a long time to heal. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Gerald walked in looking more stressed than usual. Annie, we need to talk, he said, his voice strained. I set down the knife, my heart sinking. What is it? He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. There's been a complication at work. The project I've been managing is facing serious issues, and if we don't turn it around, I could lose my job. I felt a surge of panic. What kind of issues? Budget overruns, missed deadlines, you name it. The higher-ups are breathing down my neck, and I don't know if I can fix it in time. I reached out, taking his hand. Gerald, we'll get through this. You're doing everything you can. He looked at me, his eyes filled with worry. I just don't want to let you down, Annie. Or Dad. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Charles standing there, his expression grave. Annie, Gerald, we need to talk. It's about Patricia. We led him into the living room, and he sat down, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. Patricia's in trouble. She's been involved in some shady financial dealings, and it's all coming to light now. The authorities are investigating. Gerald's face turned pale. What? How did this happen? Charles sighed. I don't know all the details yet, but it seems she's been involved in some risky investments and questionable business practices. If she's found guilty, it could ruin her. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and a strange sense of inevitability. What do we do now? Charles looked at us, his eyes filled with sadness. We need to prepare for the worst. This could impact all of us, especially if they start looking into our finances. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Gerald looked like he was about to break. This can't be happening. Not now. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We need to stay strong. We can't let this tear us apart. Charles nodded. Annie's right. We need to stick together and face this head-on. The next few days were a blur of meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and sleepless nights. The stress was taking its toll on all of us, but we tried to support each other as best we could. Gerald was barely holding it together, and I knew I had to be the strong one. One evening, as I was going through some paperwork, I found an old letter from my mother. Her words were a reminder of the strength and resilience she had always shown, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. I couldn't let Patricia's actions destroy everything we had worked for. The next morning, I gathered Gerald and Charles in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. "We can't let Patricia's mistakes define us. We need to take control of our own lives." Gerald looked at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "We need to be proactive. We can't just react to everything that's happening. We need a plan." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Annie's right. We need to take charge of our own destiny." We spent the next few hours brainstorming, coming up with a plan to protect our assets and ensure that Patricia's actions didn't drag us down with her. It was a daunting task, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope. As we worked late into the night, I realized that this crisis had brought us closer together. Gerald was finally starting to see the importance of standing up for himself and for us. Charles was a pillar of strength, guiding us with his wisdom and experience. But I knew the hardest part was yet to come. We would have to confront Patricia, face the authorities, and navigate the fallout from her actions. It would be a long and difficult journey, but we were ready to face it together. As we wrapped up our meeting, Gerald looked at me, his eyes filled with determination. "Annie, I promise you we'll get through this. No matter what happens, we'll face it together." I nodded, feeling a sense of resolve. "Yes, we will. One step at a time." The stakes had never been higher, but we were ready to fight for our future. And for the first time, I felt like we had a real chance of overcoming the challenges ahead. The morning of Patricia's court hearing arrived with a sense of dread that hung over us like a dark cloud. Gerald and I sat in the car outside the courthouse, the tension between us palpable. Charles had decided to stay home, his health too fragile to endure the stress of the proceedings. Gerald stared out the window, his face a mask of worry. "Annie, what if she goes to prison? What if they find out more than we know?" I reached over, squeezing his hand. "We'll face it together, Gerald. Whatever happens, we'll get through it." We walked into the courthouse, the cold, sterile environment amplifying our anxiety. Patricia was already there, looking more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. Her lawyer stood beside her, a stern expression on his face. The hearing was a blur of legal jargon, accusations, and defense arguments. Patricia's shady financial dealings were laid bare, and it was clear the authorities had a strong case against her. Gerald sat beside me, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. As the judge read the charges, I glanced at Patricia. For the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. But it was too little, too late. The damage had been done. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced that Patricia would be held accountable for her actions. She was sentenced to a substantial fine and community service, narrowly avoiding prison time. The relief I felt was tempered by the realization that our lives would never be the same. Outside the courthouse, Patricia approached us, her eyes filled with tears. "Gerald, Annie, I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to go this far." Gerald looked at her, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "Mom, you've hurt us more than you can imagine, but we'll find a way to move forward." Patricia nodded, her shoulders slumped. "I'll do whatever it takes to make amends." As we drove home, the weight of the day's events settled over us. Gerald was silent, lost in his thoughts. I knew this was a turning point for all of us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. That evening, as we sat in the living room, Charles joined us, his face lined with worry. "How did it go?" he asked. Gerald sighed, rubbing his temples. She avoided prison, but the fines are steep. It's going to take a long time to recover from this. Charles nodded, his expression somber. We'll get through it, son. We have to. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Patricia moved in with her sister, and Gerald and I focused on rebuilding our lives. The financial strain was immense, and the emotional toll even greater. But we were determined to move forward. One evening, as I was sorting through bills, Gerald walked in, his face pale. Annie, we have a problem. I looked up, my heart sinking. What is it? He handed me a letter from the bank. They're calling in our loan. If we can't come up with the money, we could lose the house. I felt a surge of panic. How much time do we have? 30 days, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the situation pressed down on me, and I struggled to keep my composure. We need to figure something out, Gerald. We can't lose everything. We spent the next few days frantically trying to come up with a solution. We met with financial advisors, explored every possible avenue, but the outlook was grim. The stress was taking its toll on both of us, and I could see the strain in Gerald's eyes. One evening, as we sat in the living room, exhausted and defeated, Charles walked in, holding a folder. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady. There might be a way to save the house. We looked at him, hope flickering in our eyes. What do you mean? Gerald asked. Charles opened the folder, revealing documents related to a piece of land he owned. I've been holding on to this land for years, but it's time to let it go. If we sell it, we can pay off the loan and keep the house. Tears filled my eyes as I realized the sacrifice Charles was willing to make. Charles, are you sure? He nodded, his expression resolute. Family comes first, Annie. Always. As we moved forward with the plan, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but we were facing it together, stronger than ever. And for the first time in a long while, I believed we could overcome anything that came our way. The weeks following Charles's decision to sell the land were filled with a mix of frantic activity and cautious hope. The sale went through faster than we anticipated, and the relief of paying off the loan was palpable. Yet, the emotional toll of the past months lingered, casting a shadow over our newfound stability. One evening, as I was sorting through the last of the paperwork, Gerald walked in, a solemn look on his face. Annie, we need to talk, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I looked up, my heart sinking. What is it, Gerald? He took a deep breath, sitting down across from me. I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about everything that's happened. And I realize now that I've taken you for granted for too long. I felt a lump form in my throat. Gerald, we've been through so much. But we've also come a long way. He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I know, but I also know that I've caused you a lot of pain, and I don't want to hold you back any longer. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What are you saying? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of papers. Annie, I'm giving you the freedom you deserve. These are divorce papers. I've already signed them. Tears welled up in my eyes as I took the papers from him, my hands shaking. Gerald, are you sure about this? He nodded, his expression resolute. Yes. I love you, Annie, but I know I've failed you. You deserve a chance to find happiness, to live without the burden of my mistakes. I looked down at the papers, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me felt a deep sense of loss, but another part felt a strange sense of relief. This was the closure I needed, the final step in reclaiming my life. Thank you, Gerald, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Thank you for understanding. He reached out, taking my hand. I'll always care about you, Annie, and I'll always be grateful for the time we had together. As we sat there, holding hands for what felt like the last time, I realized that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The road ahead was uncertain, but I felt a sense of empowerment, a newfound strength that I hadn't felt in years. The next day, I went to see Charles. He was sitting on the porch, a thoughtful look on his face as he watched the sunset. Charles, I need to talk to you, I said, my voice steady. He looked up, a warm smile on his face. Of course, Annie. What's on your mind? I sat down beside him, taking a deep breath. Gerald and I have decided to divorce. It's for the best. Charles nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I'm sorry to hear that, Annie. But I understand. You've been through so much. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Thank you for everything, Charles. You've been my rock through all of this. I don't know what I would have done without you. He smiled, his eyes shining with pride. You're a strong woman, Annie. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, for reclaiming your life. As we sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey had been long and difficult, but I had emerged stronger, more resilient. I had faced my fears, confronted the challenges, and come out on the other side. In the weeks that followed, I finalized the divorce, moved into a small apartment of my own, and began to rebuild my life. I reconnected with old friends, pursued new interests, and embraced the freedom that came with being on my own. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in years. I had faced the storms, weathered the challenges, and emerged stronger for it. And as I looked out at the vast expanse of the night sky, I knew that the future was filled with endless possibilities. I was free, I was empowered, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next.